Hello, everybody. May I just remind you that if you'd like to listen to this session, you should put on your headphones now. There should be a set of headphones on every chair. So if you would like to listen to this session as opposed to watching the mime, please do put on your headphones. Great. Well, thank you all for joining us and this session on Ratings Review, Insights from the International Rankings of Civil Services. My name is Amrita Devaya and I'm the Deputy Director for Civil Service Communication in the Cabinet Office, and it is my absolute pleasure to be the moderator of this session today. This session looks at governments around the world who are all tackling similar challenges, and these international rankings that we have that help governments to identify best practice amongst global leaders. So in this session, we are going to look at insights from a host of international government effectiveness rankings and discuss what they highlight about best practice in governments around the world. And I am joined by a host of brilliant panelists. I've got Matt Kirlog here, who's the data scientist from the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford. I've got João Ricardo Vasconcelos, who is the Senior Governance Specialist at the Governance Global Practice at the World Bank. I've got Barbara Ubaldi, who is the Senior Director for AI and Government Innovation at the Tony Blair Institute, and Gus O'Donnell, who is former Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Civil Service in the United Kingdom. So, Matt, I'm going to come to you first. Can you tell us a bit about the Blavatnik Index of Public Administration?
Yes, thank you, Amrita, and thank you for having me here today. It's great to talk about this project that we've been doing at the Blavatnik School now for the last just over last year, and we published the Blavatnik Index of Public Administration in December last year, and I encourage you to go and search it out on the web and investigate. I've got sort of 5 minutes to give you a sort of overview, but that's very much a sort of the tip of the iceberg. Definitely go and investigate detail. But in detail, at its core, the Blavatnik Index is a sort of comparative tool for benchmarking national civil services across 120 countries around the world. It provides a mechanism for sort of trying to help senior leaders navigate sort of the existing world of international indicators. It's not doing any primary collection itself. It's a secondary analysis of lots of big existing data. And structured around sort of 4 domains. One around strategy and leadership, so those overarching sort of stretching overall vision, core public sector values, and stewardship of institutions. So it's measuring things like integrity, openness, and we also have some measures in there around innovation. Then the next domain is public policy, which is sort of those core activities that you always think governments do, things like policy making, writing actual government policy, regulation, crisis management, etc. Then national delivery, which is those sort of, and this is where it's quite difficult sort of at an international level to really think about how to compare countries. There's lots of different jurisdictional sort of interactions. Some countries have things they do at a national level like health and education, others devolve that to other bits of the system. But national delivery is really about sort of the ability of measuring sort of the ability of national governments to oversee their sort of public sector delivery chains and oversight of that sort of system, plus as well some core delivery that happens broadly around the world at sort of some form of national activity, so tax, digital services, borders, etc. And then finally, the 4th domain is around people and processes, so that's sort of what it's like to work in the civil service, to be a civil servant, so things like HR management, diversity and inclusion, procurement, technology and workplaces. So we bring together to sort of measure all of those different aspects, 82 metrics from 17 different sources. So they're folk like the World Bank and the project that Joel's going to talk about in a minute. We use that source, but other things from both the World Bank and other multilaterals like the UN or the OECD, academic data and research, and also civil society sort of projects. And as I said, the reason for doing this is because there is this myriad of different data out there, and perhaps Gus can sort of give a practitioner view from being a head of a civil service, but trying to really understand what does that mean in practice for me running a civil service. There are already some other sort of measures out there around sort of governance, but they mix sort of those measurements of the executive, which we as civil servants sort of are responsible for and involved in, with granted very important things like democracy, the rule of law, academic and media freedoms, etc. But those aren't things that necessarily civil servants have in their gift to influence. That's for our political masters to sort of do. Then you have sort of some of the thematic things. So, for example, the GovTech Maturity Index, which particularly focuses on digital and some other aspects of sort of open government. But they're thematic. So the leaders in GDS and other sort of bits of government will care about those. But the extent to which the top of the office sees that, who knows? And then there's regular sort of data collection. So again, the purpose is sort of to corral all this together. So it's not going to be perfect because there are limitations to all these collections, but it's there to sort of give a window to this sort of the data that's out there, and to provide a sort of a comparative tool. So we only measure sort of relative assessment. So we're not setting sort of hard benchmarks as well. It's purely there to sort of inspire curiosity, I would say, is my sort of thing. I'm sort of trying to sort of remove the sort of technical expert from this and the geek that sits within. He'll come out in a minute. But I think it is that bit about, despite those limitations, just sort of actually using the data exists and we can learn some things from it. And it is to sort of encourage better learning. We just talk to, usually sort of having prior experience in the Cabinet Office and central government and engaging internationally on stuff around civil service reform, you often just talk to our friends or the people that we know best, but that might not necessarily be where the best practice is. And similarly, sort of in a development context, actually often sort of what the development agencies tend to do and is just sort of say, copy what we do. That's not necessarily the best example for countries that are trying to develop and reform their administrations, be they in Africa or Asia or Latin America. So that's my sort of pitch about what the purpose of the index is. What's it sort of high level results told us this time around. Singapore has come out top on our index, followed closely behind by Norway, Canada and Denmark in third, Finland, and then the UK just misses out from top 5 position, and it comes joint 6th with New Zealand. Then Australia is in 8th, and we have actually 4 countries in joint 10th, which is quite interesting. It's a really interesting sort of thing. We've got 4 countries there sitting in 10th, and they all actually have relative different strengths across those 4 domains. But France, Spain, Estonia, and the United States sort of sit there. And so although I think Western Europe and some of the more advanced economies tend to dominate the top 25, there's a really interesting story about sort of actually Eastern European performance. So there, Estonia comes in 10th, but Latvia, Lithuania, and Slovenia are all in the top 25. Similarly, there's an interesting story for Latin America as well. Uruguay sits in the top 25, and Colombia and Brazil are the top 2 upper middle income countries around the world. So that's the other piece as well, is really by providing this data set of sort of 120 countries, really enables countries to focus on not just necessarily, I've talked there about the top 25, but really focus on who your peer group are and find out how you compare to the people you concern yourself with. And we've set up tools that allow you to sort of sub-select that and look at compare yourself to the particular countries you're interested in. And then sort of finally, I'd sort of leave with 2 sort of particular reflections for me. One is on actually some of the correlation analysis we've done. We haven't really sort of got into this in detail yet. We're sort of, as I said, we only published in December the first sort of set of results. We're sort of working through that further analysis. But 2 of the things we looked at were around sort of overall size of countries, because obviously there's a natural thing, big countries it's difficult, small countries it's easy. Actually, when we've looked at that, we haven't found a correlation between overall sort of population size and people's scores in the index. There are big countries that do well and small countries that do badly. Similarly, actually, also, when we look at the size of the public sector, we also haven't found a correlation between the size of the public sector and effectiveness. There are countries with big states that do well, there are countries with big states that do badly. And the same with small countries with small public sectors. So not necessarily automatically reaching for the sort of, while there is always a place for sort of optimization and reform in that sort of fiscal and people space, it's not necessarily the only route to a better and more efficient government. So I'd probably think that one's one of the things to explore further, certainly. And then there's also that sort of piece around, even if you're at the top, you don't necessarily rest on your laurels. Within a month of the index sort of publishing, Singapore sort of obviously came first. They came second on tax administration. But a month later, I was having a conversation with the head of strategy at the Singaporean tax agency to find out, well, how do we perform? And actually, there are some measures. When you look at the source data, yes, overall they're second, but there are a couple of places where they're languishing compared to sort of other high-income economies, sort of very middling, if not below sort of the middle of the position for that group of their peers. So I think there's always something to learn from others, and that's really the sort of the critical thing. And then the final piece I'd sort of just end on is around, obviously we're at a conference called Innovation. We do actually have, measuring public sector innovation is really, really difficult, especially not just sort of within countries, certainly internationally. But we do have sort of 3 very partial metrics that are there. And one of them is from one of my favorite little nerdy things in this, which is a survey of tax agencies around the world that's run through the IMF and the OECD. In that, it's mainly collecting stuff about, well, what taxes do you have and how much have you got, but it has some things about running the tax agency. One of those is actually about the use of innovative practices and technologies. Now, if we were at this conference 10 years ago, we'd been talking about blockchain, I'm sure. Of the 174 countries in this data set, only 12 of them say that they use blockchain in their tax agencies. So, not to say that sort of to be a skeptic about AI. I think there's lots of opportunities here, but I think it just is it's a cautionary tale for us to remember that sort of technology fads come and they go, and we need to just make sure we think about these things properly and don't necessarily always get caught up in the hype of them. And I think this is a very interesting little illustration that we get about blockchain. But those are sort of that's the index in its sort of very rapid summary, and I'm happy to take questions both from yourself and the floor in due course.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Matt. Really interesting, and I think some interesting points on collaboration, best practice and learning that I'm sure will come out in questions later. Zhao, I want to come to you next. Can you give us a bit of an overview of the World Bank GovTech Maturity Index, please?
Okay. So first of all, thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Presenting to you what is the GovTech Maturity Index, and looking here at the audience. I don't need to convince each one of you about the digital transition, that it's here, that it changes the way that we connect, that we work, that we live our lives right now. But probably one of the key points that I would like to highlight right now is when we talk about GovTech, when we talk about government technology, it's actually not really about technology, okay? So that's the big paradox that I'm sharing here with you. Because when we discuss GovTech or the digital transformation of governments with the different public sector leaders and implementers, it's always the questions on the settings, the people, the culture and the processes that come up as fundamental, as the biggest challenges that are faced by the public sector. So the World Bank has been working in the digital transition of government for more than for several decades, let's say. But we launched in the end of 2019 the GovTech Global Partnership, and we understand GovTech, let me also make the statement here, as an advanced stage of digital government. So we don't understand it in the strict sense of just a relationship between the government and the ecosystem of startups, for instance, but really as an advanced stage, including issues like digital service delivery, citizen engagement, core government systems, or key enablers on this. And we also understand in this perspective that if you want to transform governments, you need, of course, public expertise, but you need also to bring the non-government stakeholders on board. So you need to bring the academia, you need to bring the private sector, you need to bring the civil society on board. And that's why we as a basis of our work, we have in the GovTech Global Partnership, we have more than 100 partners that join us and that with whom we collaborate right now. Countries with different levels of digital development, let me say, from different regions of the globe, different contexts, but also bring here private sector, international organizations on this, specifically on the GovTech Maturity Index. So it's an index that measures GovTech maturity in 198 economies, and it's based on 4 dimensions. On the one hand, core government systems, second dimension, public service delivery, a third one on citizen engagement, and a fourth on GovTech enablers. What we try to see here, it's really to have a good basis of knowledge about how different governments are standing in this area, and namely on the different indicators here. We've done already 2 editions. So first one it was in 2000, a second one in 2022, and we were able to, let's say, based on the level of maturity, to place countries in, let's say, 4 levels of GovTech maturity. So countries that are more advanced, countries that are, let's say, starting their journey or are not that advanced on this. So and you can see there on the map an idea about how the world performs on this. But let me also, and this is going deep on the different indicators. So you have there indicators on core government systems, on digital service delivery, on citizen engagement and enablers. When we mean core government systems, we mean issues like public financial management systems. We mean human resources management. We mean digital procurement, digital budgeting, for instance. So really the pieces that governments need to have in place to navigate this transition. Regarding digital service delivery, the way that that the services are provided, and going to citizen engagement, I think the kind of feedback that is received from the citizens, and last but not least, the GovTech enablers that go from issues like what is the institutional setting that governments have, to questions like digital identity, for instance, etc. And all this give us a panorama about how countries stand. I'm presenting there some numbers, and for instance, we can see that in the different regions of the globe, it's the countries from ACA, or Europe and Central Asia, that better perform on this on the different dimensions. So there are different. I could talk for hours about each one of the results that are presented here, but we can see also, for instance, that countries that in Africa, for instance, are struggling more on this different dimension. In any case, let me share with you some findings or big issues that we've noted. So we noticed that from the first to the second edition of the GovTech Maturity Index, so we see a progressive digital divide between countries that are more advanced regarding countries that are less advanced in this area, and that's a big worry, namely for the World Bank as a development organization. There's also an indicator that I'd like to highlight, that is the fact that citizen engagement it's the dimension where countries perform in a less good way, let's say. And this happens whether we look at Europe and Central Asia, where we look to the Middle East, or to Africa, or to Latin America. Besides that, yeah, different countries are putting efforts to have entities that can lead this kind of transformation to a whole government system. About the UK, just to give you a highlight here, and happy then to also discuss with the different participants here. On the one hand, we can see that the UK is a leader in this area, so it performs among the countries that are more advanced here. 2 things can be highlighted from the GTMI results. One, and it's here, is actually the UK is the one where the dimension of citizen engagement performs best, at least compared with the global average and with the regional average out there. So this is quite interesting. The flip side of the coin is that, surprisingly or not, it's in the dimension of core government systems, namely on the parts of public financial management, human resources management, digital procurement, etc., where more space for improvement can be found, as we normally say. Having highlighted this, and to finalize on the GTMI, one of the things, and it's good to be here with a big audience, is that we make available all the results in what we call our GTMI dashboard. So it's if you do a Google search, so you can find it, you can play with it, you can see how the different countries perform on this different indicators, and all the data, all the raw data that we collect within the GTMI is available online and for free. So exactly the database of the information that we collect from the countries is available, so you can download it, you can play with it, you can create value on top of it, and that's actually one of the purpose that we have here. Let me say that the 2025 edition is right now underway, so the data collection of the GTMI 2025 is underway, and we hope to have results by after the summer, let's say, in September. And sharing also with you that, namely within our GovTech Global Forum in May 27, 28, and that you are all invited, we'll have opportunity to discuss this and several other issues. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And some really interesting things that you brought out there, João, specifically around that sort of whole system approach to delivering change and public participation. Gus, I'm going to come to you next. As a former Cabinet Secretary, what value would this type of ranking have had for you and your colleagues, and why do you think they are useful?
Okay, thank you. And they're both really, really interesting things. I was involved very much in the Blavatnik Index. I'd say four things, right? First of all, one thing I learned, it's a old phrase, if you treasure it, measure it, right? And what we're doing here is measuring the public sector. We're measuring either its performance on a whole range of things, or its performance in particularly innovation and particularly technology. That really matters, because if you think about what we do with the private sector, every individual company, there's 1,001 measures, there's all sorts of things. Public sector, it's really difficult. You try measuring the output of the defense sector. We weren't invaded last year. Wow, that's pretty good, but it's really quite hard measuring outputs of public sector. So anything which tries to get us into this understanding that actually the public sector is really important. You look at the size of the public sector in these countries, look at the size in the UK, it's huge. You can't just ignore this sector. If you want to increase productivity in the UK economy, which the UK government goes on about a lot, you've got to look at the public sector as well as the private sector. So number one, if you treasure it, measure it. That's why back in 2010, 2011, I started the measurement of life satisfaction for the UK, so that we have a measure of how people feel about their lives. Could say a lot more about that if people are interested. Secondly, as has come out already of these things, it tells you, as a cabinet secretary, where gains are possible. So you can look at these indices and see, actually, we're doing really badly in this area. So let's find out, because particularly given the country mix, you can say, look, you look at Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, they're all Westminster model democracies. So the kind of form of government is quite similar. A lot of them are similar in other respects with respect to income and things like that. So how come someone else is doing a lot better than us in one of these indices? So you go and you ask them. I mean, it was really interesting going to Singapore to present these results. It was fantastic because obviously Singapore was #1, so they loved it. But you did get an impression from them of some of the things that are going on, some of which you measure well, some you don't. Like the thing about Singapore is ministers and civil servants, massive trust and respect for each other. They're all paid incredibly well. I think a really important measure for the civil servants to understand in this room that high pay, really good thing, right? So that's the second thing. So it tells you where gains are possible. Thirdly, there's a big PR thing. You'll see, dare I say it, some people using phrases like Project Chainsaw. There's a whole PR thing, like, the public sector, they don't do anything useful, so let's cut them. That's fine, you can do that, and it won't make any difference, right? It's really important to get across to people that actually the public sector does important things, and in many respects, that these different indices show you, they do it really well. They do it a lot better than other countries because a lot of these things, you know, I keep saying my private sector colleagues, oh, the NHS, you know, I say, okay, what if I told you you had to sell everything for free? Yeah, good luck, okay? Right, so you're doing something, and by the way, your boss, who's usually a CEO who's worked in the industry for 30 years, nah, sorry. If for example, my boss, when I was dealing with pensions, right, Minister for Pensions, 9 ministers for pensions in 5 years. Now, fortunately, pensions kind of short-run thing, isn't it? So it doesn't really matter. Their background in pensions, I actually have one minister who actually understood pensions, Steve Webb. Brilliant, fantastic. So it does matter from the PR point of view, explaining what we're actually not so terrible as some will make out. And the fourth thing, I think this is for me really, really important, is that focus on what really matters. So if you think about when you start talking about technology, when we start talking about AI, there's a lot of temptation to say, okay, so how can we use AI in government services? Which is the wrong question, right? The right question is, how can we improve public services? And there's all sorts of ways of doing this, right? And if you get this wrong, you kind of get this lurch into, let's do something really fancy. And believe me, when I was in Singapore, I had a long session with my Australian colleagues on something called robo-debt, right? Robo-debt basically did the tax stuff and ended up putting loads of people in prison who hadn't actually, who should never have been there. Makes our post office thing in the UK look kind of minor, right? It was a dramatically ill thought through leap into a technological world. So when you kind of get those opportunities to learn from each other and you get that focus, which a lot of this work does, on outcomes, what you really want to achieve and how the technology can help you, which you talked about people and cultures, really, really important that you focus on delivering the right thing, not to saying, okay, let's all use this, or let's all suddenly have chat GPT and, you know, like, oh my God, you know, please, let's think carefully about what the things we really want to do are and how technology can help us.
Fantastic. Some really interesting points there as well. I love those 4 things, particularly civil service pay.
Thought you would.
Barbara, coming to you, can you tell us a little bit more about your previous work at the OECD and your current role, obviously, at the TBI, and how you see these types of rankings helping governments to drive that change?
Thank you, Amrita, and it's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you for inviting me to join this conversation. What's interesting is that I come with 24 years of experience working with governments to support a digital transformation. I was at the OECD for 16 years, and before that I was with the UN for about 9 years, where I worked on the eGov index. So what's interesting is that, like, I will repeat many of the things that my colleagues said. So I think it's interesting that we are all aligned on that. We're talking about a transformation here, right? That is happening thanks to digital tools and technology. But as Joao said, it's not about technology and it's not about those tools. So if we look about the transformation, it's about change and it's about results and it's about solving problems. So in that sense, I think that one of the biggest challenges that governments have is to be ambitious on one side, because changing and transforming things that have been done in a certain way, starting from the analog age, takes a lot of courage, takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of resources of all kind. And while being ambitious, they also need to be realistic, right? Because oftentimes, sure, if we look at the top ranking countries in all benchmarks, they're almost all the same. The GovTech Index, the eGov Index of the UN, the OECD Index, the index that Platinum just developed on public administration, it's almost the same countries, but if we look at the specific conditions those countries have in place, very few other countries can actually replicate them. So I think in that scenario, why are these indexes so important? First of all, because I couldn't agree more with Gus, you can't improve what you don't monitor and what you don't measure. So in that sense, I think that first of all, those indexes provide an evidence-based assessment. Like Matt said, one thing is talking to your colleagues and say, the art is possible, I read an article and that's so interesting what Singapore is doing on that, let's do it. Well, when you have an evidence-based way to monitor what you're doing, to assess what you're doing, it's a different story. It's also to sell a narrative to the minister that maybe doesn't get it, doesn't understand it. So to justify investments and changes, for example, having evidence showing what you need to do to improve and what others have done, I think it's a very strong, compelling measure. Second, they help peer learning. Peer learning means going beyond the benchmark. Like Joao said, in the case of the GovTech Index of the bank and other indexes as well, they have dashboards that back them up, that help understand what's behind a ranking, that helps telling or understanding stories of what has worked and hasn't worked in another country. But third, through the benchmarking exercise, these indexes enable you to say, okay, if I look at the countries that I am inspired by, this is where I want to get to, but can I see if there's a cluster of countries where I can realistically compare with and work with in order to advance? So in a way, they support the collaboration which happens across countries. And it's very interesting because we always think of collaboration in terms of north-south collaboration. There's so much collaboration that can happen south-south or north-north. And it's about, using these indexes to back up that collaboration as well, because improvement also helps learning from others, but also avoiding mistakes done by others, for example. So in that sense, I think that why are they so useful? First of all, if they have good data that backs up, because as I said, they're evidence-based, so the data needs to be good. Good means good quality, reliable, and available. Benchmarking 38 countries is not like benchmarking 198 or 193 like the UN and the World Bank are doing. So I think data is extremely important. Second, methodology. Methodologies need to be solid. They hold values, right? So I've been in this until December of last year. I've been in this collaboration and conversation with peer international organizations. And one of the key points that we had said is like each one of us can have a different tool, but we need to be aligned on the values that we want. That's why Joao is saying something that I subscribe 100%. It's not about the digital, it's about the transformation or the transition that we are witnessing. And then the third element I think that is extremely important is to remember that this is a means to an end, right? So in my current job, but in the previous job as well, many political leaders would come and say, yeah, I need your help to solve a problem. Okay, what's your problem? I want to get better in a ranking. So obviously, that's not the problem, right? So accompanying the other side to make the most of these indexes, I think it's the shared responsibility that we have because they can really make a huge impact. So they have on their side the responsibility of being clear on the values that they embed and make sure that these values are about the transformation and not about just using AI, but AI for what? But at the same time, I think it's also a communication exercise we need to do with leaders around the world to understand the value of those indexes.
Fantastic. I couldn't agree more. The question that I ask all the time is, to what end? Why are we doing this? What is it for? And obviously, in my world, what's the story we're trying to tell off the back of it? Some really, really interesting points there as well. I've written loads of notes. But Gus and Barbara, I'd like to ask you both another question, please. So what are some of the challenges or ways in which these rankings could be improved to make them even more useful? Gus, do you want to come in first?
So yeah, I mean, we've observed through this work that there are some areas where you just don't have data for some countries. So trying to get the pressure on countries to think about sensible ways of measuring these things, it's and quite often it's outside bodies that do it. The area I concentrate on a lot is well-being, but having the World Happiness Report, UN World Happiness Report, you've defined something which you have as an indicator which everyone looks at. Now, no one's going to agree on one indicator being the perfect for everything. So sometimes you just have to say, here are 3 or 4 that roughly do the same thing. But getting that data and making sure that everyone's measuring the same thing. And then please don't change it all the time, because then you don't get a time series. Then you can't do the analysis. It's really hard. But you have to understand, I started life teaching econometrics. So for me, data is everything. I want to use it in a way that's comparable. But when you get bad data and suddenly someone changes the definition, you want to scream because, whoa, where do you go from there? It's harder. And I think good data, there's a great risk as we go into this world of AI and LLMs and all the rest of it, that we get rubbish data. We get masses of it and it's terrible. So I think understanding data and then understanding how you analyze data. I think we've got to get to people realizing what really works. And I think I would say the number one thing that I have with politicians is explaining the difference between correlation and causation. That is like, if only I had enough time to talk to them about that. And then secondly, decision-making under uncertainty. Because you're not going to know perfectly what works and what doesn't. And quite often you may have very poor data, but quite often the solution to poor data is to create more data. If you look at the COVID crisis, you know, one of the biggest things we've ever had. In the UK, we had complete garbage about cases. We had no idea really what was going on. And then the ONS, God bless them, started doing a random sample. And suddenly we started to know what was actually happening. And so that was an example of there being a problem and you decide to create the data. So quite a lot of this work, they need to understand what the real problem is, then what the model is you're going to use for it, and then what the data is that you need to understand that. And then some of that you've got, and some of that you might have to create. And so I think there's a way of thinking about the world which starts from what's the problem you're trying to solve to how do you use these indicators. And so I think when we think about that, what are the big problems the world's got to solve at the minute? You know, you think about things like climate change, aging, there's all sorts of big things. So what's the kind of data we might need for that? You know, and I think with climate change, it was something that, you know, you go back and nobody's measuring it. You know, what do we know about CO2 levels? And suddenly as you start to understand the problem, as you start to become more sophisticated, you start thinking about better measures, and that leads to better understanding, which in turn leads to better policies.
Fantastic. Barbara?
Yeah, I think it's the two main challenges are credibility and relevance. So I think, you know, picking on some of the comments that Gus made, first of all, I think it's extremely important to have a solid methodology, which is clear, and you need to be transparent around that, and you need to be consistent in keeping using it, like Gus said. That transparency needs to be complemented also by the fact that you need to be complementary with other indexes that are out there. Having done this work for many years and having worked with governments for many years in getting data to calculate the indexes, it's a lot of work that governments go through, right, to give you the data when they are the primary source of the data. And so making sure that you can answer their criticism when they say, well, but the World Bank is measuring the same stuff. Why are you doing it, you know, twice? Or same with the UN or the Commission, the European Commission as well. Well, being able to say these exercises complement each other, I think it's extremely important to make sure that governments keep seeing the credibility and the relevance and keep engaging and using these indexes. So I think in that sense, there are three elements that are important. Data, I'm not going to repeat what I said before and what Gus said extremely well. Second, once again, a methodology that is designed together with the ones who need to use it, I think it's a big plus. So it took us 15 years at the OECD to develop the index. That was the first task I got when I joined the OECD 16 years ago. And the methodology was developed with the countries. And the Digital Government Index, which measures the maturity governments have in using technology to transform how they function, it's something that now the member countries own, and they engage and then invest in providing the data for the index to be calculated. And third is people. Either if the primary source of your data is not the government, but it's like a website, or you need to have good people in the team to be able to identify the good data and work with the data and calculate and validate. Because if a civil servant or an executive uses the index to convince the minister, you bloody want to make sure that the data is correct and is valid and is relevant. And so people, either if you work with governments, you need to invest with the teams in government that need to give you the data, or if you don't go work with governments, but eventually the government have to use your index, you need to have good people who actually can provide a credible result that can be used for policy making.
Couldn't agree more. Good people. And there's a really lovely, I mean, we could talk about this for ages, but I'm aware of the time, but there's a really lovely correlation between happiness, good people, and their happiness at work, and then productivity as well. And there's a huge thing around culture. However, we have got 10 minutes left of this session, so I'm going to open up to questions from the floor. I believe we've got some roving mics, so if you do have any questions, please stick your arm in the air, and our wonderful team will come and find you. Does anyone have a question for the panel? Or we've answered them all?
Over there.
Is there one over there? There we go. Thank you.
Can you all hear me? Yeah, great. Hi, I'm Charlotte. I work in the MOJ's innovation team. I think it was Matt who mentioned about a decade ago, everyone was talking about blockchain and the way it was going to revolutionize tax administration. In 10 years' time, what do you think we'll look back on and think, that was a fad?
Oh, I don't. I'm not. I don't necessarily know. I'm not an avowedly a sort of a tech specialist in government, so I don't necessarily want a crystal ball. I think everyone actually. I think that's the other thing, is that we don't know actually what we will look back on and go, well, that was a fad. I don't think AI is a fad. It is here. It's definitely working. There's been some, like, the thing is, most of AI is just actually statistics at scale. It's just the fact we now have computers that are big enough and scary enough that they can do giant levels of computation and prediction. But I do think there is sort of, I think it features back to sort of Gus's point about sort of our question should be, we want to improve public services, and then the sub-question is, how do we use AI to help us in that? Not, I want to use AI to make public services better. And I think that's the framing that we need to make sure we're in, so that we don't get to that point of being caught up in a particular fad, which I think sort of you see sort of that's what happened sort of with Bitcoin, with sort of blockchain, and then you've got the explosion of crypto that happened off the back of blockchain. There are a couple of examples in the public sector where blockchain has been used in sort of digital contracts, in certain aspects of sort of that piece where actually that form of public authentication and security is useful, but they are niche requirements. I think it's just about making sure we're sort of open to the fact that things might work out, they might not. And I think that's the other bit, is about testing and learning, really.
Absolutely. Thank you, Matt. We've got another question from over there, and then one over here.
Hi, thank you. My name is Bridget. I work in the AI Safety and Security Institute. And I'm curious if you have seen any particular methodologies work in other civil services or public services around the world in attracting, promoting, and incentivizing great talent within different countries. If there's anything the UK is doing really well, or if there's other things we could learn from other institutes.
Who would like to start with that one?
Well, I just say, in the UK, we've made it very hard because of our pay structure. And in particular, the way in which we pay civil servants, which is, as an economist, I think is just completely mad, right? So mostly you get paid when you've retired, right? I am a recipient of a very large pension, thank you very much. Not quite sure how this incentivized me when I was working. So, yeah, we got the pay pension balance seriously out of kilter. We've also got the problem that we don't pay enough. And I think that is, to my mind, we need a much higher quality, smaller civil service, actually. And we're going to have to come to grips with that. So I think we are starting to realize that. We are starting to realize that actually, if there's a market out there, you've got to compete with it. And I've seen it in areas where you can keep policy people, because actually there isn't, A, the jobs are really interesting, and B, there's not the equivalent one quite out there. But you take something like procurement, right? Not quite as sexy in terms of having ministers every day and like working out these big policy questions, but boy, does the private sector pay well for a procurement expert, and we don't pay quite so much. So I think we need to think much more about a more fluid remuneration structure. So I would say we don't do it so well. The Singaporeans, it's to die for, right? I mean, you can understand why they come top, right? Because I've been in meetings, I go there every year. Been in meetings with people talking about various subjects. You don't know who the ministers are and who the civil servants are. They trust each other. They probably, some of the ministers have been in the civil service. Some of the civil servants will go out to the private sector. Much more interchange between all the sectors. That's another thing I think is really important. Whereas if you take the UK, it's like, oh my God, he's gone to work for the private sector. Obviously, he's completely corrupt and he was giving them contracts beforehand. So we have this big system of preventing movement between the sectors, which I think kind of sometimes fails to achieve what we really want, which is people who understand all these different sectors. So yeah, I think there's a lot we can learn from particularly Singapore. And we do need to move on this if we're going to actually be at the forefront.
You want me to compliment?
Yeah, please, please. John.
So I think two countries that are very, keen on addressing these issues are Denmark and Australia. And I think something that makes a difference is understanding that you need to offer the opportunity to people joining the civil service to work in a different way, which is a matter of having roles that are adjusted, or profiles that are adjusted to 2025. That's something that often doesn't happen. So you hire people with job descriptions that were relevant 10, 15 years ago. And second, it's about having the leadership in place that enables the people to work in a different way. It's about innovation in action, right? So those two things are very difficult to change. Clearly, they complement what Gus said, but I don't think it's only about paying, right? Many young people join the public sector and then they leave because they don't feel that they belong to an environment where they need to work, according to criteria and profiles and moralities that belong to another era.
Really interesting. Sorry.
Yeah. If I can also add on this, a very good question. Of course, there's not a silver bullet that you can use for it. But coming back to the topic here of our discussion, sometimes when we look at the ratings and all the indexes that are out there, we really need to have in mind that and focus on the fact that those are acknowledgement instruments, meaning their main purpose should not be to, let's say, to rank countries. Eventually, when we look at the indexes, we should also try to avoid just looking, I don't know, who are the champions on this, and let me see if I can copy or get something from there to my country, but really as an instrument where you can know what country A is doing, what country B is doing, and I think from my experience, very frequently you will find the solution to the question on your country, not necessarily in the front runners, not necessarily on the champions on it, but when you compare with some of your peers, and sometimes also with countries that are totally different from what you are doing. So if you have this capacity also to look at these indexes from this perspective, I think it's a plus. Just an advice.
No, really interesting. I think there's a huge piece on trust that sort of came out in everything that you were saying, and not for this session, but there's a really, really interesting conversation to be had there on both rankings and trust and the context and the culture of the organisation. I believe there was a question over here.
Hello, Marie from the Department for Transport. So looking back at the theme of this is innovation, and you've also looking at international comparisons. We've also spoken around indices relating to very similar how kind of Western democracies perform. Are there things we can consider from kind of political systems where perhaps democracy isn't the kind of the centre or the system that's used, and how that impacts on innovation, also bearing in mind that collectively we generally feel democracy is the way forward, and we're promoting that as kind of on a global scale. Thanks.
Who would like to go? Go on, Matt.
So I think the Blavatnik Index, we specifically haven't used democracy as part of the measures. It does come out in the sort of like in the rankings. Western liberal democracies do tend to come up higher. You can certainly see that, but we haven't we've not specifically measured for that. I think there are definitely things that you can learn from other countries. I think this is one of the this isn't actually coming out of the data. This is sort of an anecdote from my own past experience. I had a brief stint when I actually first met Barbara and Joao when I worked for the OECD, and I worked in their Observatory of Public Sector Innovation. One of they run an annual call for case studies. One of the most interesting projects that came out in 1 year was something from Indonesia, where they Jakarta suffers from lots of flooding issues. They have got some sort of hydrological flood monitoring and sensors like we have in the UK, but they don't have nearly the same level of tech. They actually did a really interesting project where they were merging social media live reporting on Twitter and Facebook with those flood models to find out where people were being affected. And I think that's the interesting thing as well, is that yes, these rankings can tell us some things, but generally we just need to be a lot more curious as civil servants. I also another anecdote where I got some really interesting examples from the French equivalent of DWP Job Centre Plus. Passed them over to the DWP head of strategy, heard nothing from them. So that's not necessarily to sort of specifically cite on that, but it's the case of just being more open and being more curious to sort of things that are happening. Yes, this is one way of looking at it, but it's not the only way.
There are two things I'd say on the democracy point. First of all, when you look at the most successful countries in the world, and I hate to say it, it's always the Scandis. They come top of everything, right? And you look at, say, the Economist Intelligence Unit Index of Quality of Democracy. It's the Scandis, right? So there is quite a strong correlation, and my suspicion is the causation goes both ways between these two. The one thing I'd say is also this point about transparency and openness and all the rest of it. I remember when I was growing up, my big hero in economics was Amartya Sen, who'd written a book about the causes of famines around the world and what was best at stopping famines. And you'd think, well, the answer might be understanding how to grow crops or whatever. Free press. If you had a free press, they would make sure that a country couldn't cover up the fact that they were having famines, which meant that it was addressed earlier. So sometimes you need to think quite laterally about what really important things are. And democracies tend to end up with free press. So, these things all feed in.
Thank you all very much. I'm afraid we've come to the end of the session, which I'm sure you'll all agree was absolutely fascinating. Top three things that I'm taking away are the focus on outcomes. What are we trying to change? What is the problem we're trying to solve? And asking ourselves that question relentlessly. Understanding how we use the data that we have and using that to give good advice, and balancing our ambition with the reality of the context in which we're operating. And finally, that the information is out there and there is a real opportunity for us to be curious, to collaborate and learn and to really deliver positive change. Thank you all ever so much. Thank you to our brilliant panel, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.